Mhm.
Why?
Alrighty. Hello and welcome to the streaming Parson reads the Book of Acts. And today we are reading through chapters 21 and 22. And basically, we are on the final stretch of the Book of Acts. Book of Acts doesn't have that many more chapters. We'll probably finish right as August starts. What day is it? Today's like, what, the 13th of July? So we got 3 more Wednesdays in July, which means we'll probably finish up Acts. No, yeah, we'll be able to finish Acts before August starts, and then we'll get into the book of Romans. And by the time that happens, we'll move the Bible studies back to Fridays, and then we'll be streaming Xenoblade Chronicles on Mondays and Wednesdays. But more information on that later. And of course, I do have information in my Discord as well. So if you want to have access to that, just give me a DM. The DM, my personal Discord is in the description. And the reason why I just kind of do it that way is because one of the annoying things if you give like a public domain to like public access to your Discord, so then you just get like people like just spam and crap in it, and that just gets annoying. And so just kind of saving that trouble, and yes, putting a middleman step in there, but that's fine. So we are approaching the end of Acts. We won't be able to finish Acts until August actually starts, and then it'll be kind of weird. Where like the last part in the Book of Acts won't be till like the BC weekend, and that's assuming I'm even streaming then, but we'll see. But anyway, as far as today's reading is concerned, we'll be reading chapters 21 and 22. I encourage you guys to follow along in our reading. I'll be using the New International Version with some Michael Ewan abridged. I encourage you guys to follow along, just get the Bible on your desktop, a Bible app. They're free, no reason not to use them. So I encourage you to do that. Before we start, I will begin with a quick word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time. We thank you for this day that we have to read your word. Just pray that as we read your word today, you would continue to bless us and show us what it means to be faithful to you, you know, in a world that can be at times, if not often, hostile to the gospel message. But Lord, lead us in a way to be faithful to the truth. I pray this in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. Okay, so just a quick kind of recap, as well as kind of like the preface of this final stretch of the book of Acts, even though like we still got 4 weeks of this. But basically, we are entering the final kind of story arc of the book of Acts. And what we had throughout the book of Acts was kind of this birthing of Christianity as a movement, a cultural phenomenon. But more than just a cultural phenomenon within the Jewish world, but it had expanded far beyond that. And that led to the Missionary Arc, as I like to call it, which focuses on the Apostle Paul, or Saint Paul, or whatever you want to call him, and his exploits going from place to place, and wherever he went, there was a fair amount of success in spreading the gospel. And he primarily spread the gospel to non-Jewish audiences, because the Jewish audiences were kind of, I don't know, they're being really hard-headed, and they didn't want to listen to Paul. So Paul's like, fine, you don't want to hear the gospel message, I'll just go to, whoever will hear. And that would be the Gentiles, basically a bunch of non-Jews. And so Paul had been doing this, and he had been going from place to place. But as we entered the last story arc of the book of Acts, it primarily focuses on Paul's return to Jerusalem and kind of the controversy that is caused by this. And then, of course, it ends, spoilers for a 2,000-year-old book, but spoilers, basically what happens is Paul, he'll want to go to Rome. And that will, as historical records even point out, that would be the end. Like St. Paul, people know the later parts of his life that he was a guy that was executed in Rome in 67 AD. So we are reading that later part. We're probably in the early 60s of the first century. When I say the early 60s, we're in the early 60s by the time we're here with Paul. And of course, we have a couple of years where Paul writes letters and spends time in moving from prison to prison in Rome and so on. But basically, as far as the book of Acts is concerned, we're at the part where it leads up to those final years of Paul. And it all starts with him returning to Jerusalem after several missionary trips, spreading the gospel to various places in Southern Europe, basically, Greece, and a bunch of the cities in southern Greece. All right, so here we go, chapter 21. Now, after we had torn ourselves away from them, the church of Ephesus, we put out to sea and sailed straight for Kos. The next day, we went to Rhodes, and from there to Patara. We found a ship crossing over to Phoenicia, and went on board and set sail. After sighting Cyprus and passing to the south of it, we sailed on to Syria. I don't know if you can hear that, but I'm hearing background music from people in the house. Anyway, sorry if it ends up being annoying, just let me know. Verse 3, after sighting Cyprus and passing to the south of it, we sailed on to Syria. We landed at Tyre, where our ship was to unload its cargo. We sought out the disciples there and stayed with them for 7 days. Through the Spirit, they urged Paul not to go to Jerusalem. When it was time to leave, we went and continued on our way. All of them, including the wives and children, accompanied us out of the city. And there on the beach, we knelt to pray. After saying goodbye to each other, we went aboard the ship and they returned home. We continued our voyage from Tyre and landed at Ptolemais, where we greeted the brothers and sisters and stayed with them for a few days. Leaving the next, we reached Caesarea and stayed at the house of Philip the Evangelist, one of the 7. He had 4 unmarried daughters who prophesied. After we had been there a number of days, a prophet named Agabus came down from Judea. Coming over to us, he took Paul's belt and tied his own hands and feet with it and said, "The Holy Spirit says, in this way, the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem will bind the owner of this belt and will hand him over to the Gentiles." When we heard this, we and the people there pleaded with Paul not to go up to Jerusalem. Then Paul answered, "Why are you weeping and breaking my heart? I am ready not only to be bound, but also to die in Jerusalem for the name of the Lord Jesus." When he would not be dissuaded, we gave up and said, "The Lord's will be done." After this, we started on our way up to Jerusalem. Some of the disciples from Caesarea accompanied us and brought us to the home of Mnason. Why would they bother cramming 2 consonants like that? But anyway, Mnason, where we were to stay. Now he was a man from Cyprus and one of the early disciples. When we arrived at Jerusalem, the brothers and sisters received us warmly. The next day, Paul and the rest of us went to see James, and all the elders were present. Paul greeted them and reported in detail what God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. And when they heard this, they praised God. Then they said to Paul, "You see, brother, how many thousands of Jews have believed, and all of them are zealous for the law. They have been informed that you teach all the Jews who live among the Gentiles to turn away from Moses, telling them to not circumcise their children or live according to our customs. Now what shall we do? They will certainly hear that you have come. So do what we tell you. There are 4 men with us who have made a vow. Now take these men with you and join in their purification rites and pay their expenses, so that they can have their heads shaved. Then everyone will know there is no truth in these reports about you, but that you are living in obedience to the law. As for the Gentile believers, we have written to them our decision that they should abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from the meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality." The next day, Paul took the men and purified himself along with them. Then he went to the temple and gave notice of the date when the days of purification would end, and the offering would be made for each of them. When the 7 days were nearly over, some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple. And they stirred up the whole crowd, seizing him, shouting, "Fellow Israelites, help us! This is the man who teaches everyone, everywhere, against our people and our law and this place. And besides, he has brought Greeks into the temple and defiled this holy place." For they had seen previously Trophimus, the Ephesian, in the city with Paul, and assumed that Paul had brought him into the temple. The whole city was roused, and the people came running from all directions. Seizing Paul, they dragged him from the temple, and immediately the gates were shut. While they were trying to kill Paul, news reached the commander of the Roman troops, that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. He at once took some officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. When the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. The commander came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. Then he asked who he was and what he had done. Some of the crowd shouted one thing and some another, and since the commander could not get the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. When Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great he had to be carried by the soldiers. The crowd that followed kept shouting, "Get rid of him!" As the soldiers were about to take Paul into the barracks, he asked the commander, "May I say something to you?" "Do you speak Greek?" the commander replied. "Oh, sorry. Yeah. No, sorry. I thought that I messed up the dialogue there. Because this is still the general talking. "Aren't you the Egyptian who started a revolt and led 4,000 terrorists out into the wilderness some time ago?" Paul answered, "I am a Jew from Tarsus, in Cilicia, a citizen of no ordinary city. Please, let me speak to the people." After receiving the commander's permission, Paul stood on the steps and motioned to the crowd. When they were all silent, he said to them in Aramaic. Okay, and then chapter 22 begins the speech, so we're going to take a pause before we got a long speech ahead of us, so chapter 22 is basically a speech. But chapter 21 basically is the build-up to very interesting turn of events for Paul. Now, the Bible is not even remotely subtle when it comes to crazy stuff's gonna go down for Paul, basically. And chapter 21 is not even remotely subtle. When it's like, oh, Paul goes from place to place. And the Bible even points out that people were led by the Spirit. And they were like, oh, Paul, they're warning Paul, don't go to Jerusalem. It's a bad idea. Because I think what's safe to assume is that, and this is one of those weird things that many Christians may overstep, if you will, when the Spirit speaks to them, if for lack of better words. And so okay, so an example of some Christians overstepping is where some Christians would say, well, God gave me this message and it means this and that, and this is what we must do. But in a way, we don't really know exactly what God wants us to do at any given time. It's contrary to popular belief, and contrary to many Christians talk about how God has this clear set of directions in your life. Now I know where they get that idea from. You could read stuff like in the Psalms about how the psalmist will say that God says, the Lord has said, I laid out plans for you in life. Read in Jeremiah, the famous prosperity gospel verse. I have plans of blessing in your life and to give you peace and all that stuff. And at least, a lot of prosperity gospel people rely on that Jeremiah verse. For I know the plans of your life, kind of thing. And, there's stuff like that. And I'm not undermining that, obviously, God is sovereign and he knows how things will turn out. But there's a difference between the fact that God knows and God dictating how it goes down, if that makes sense. So this is one of those things, and this is okay, so take what I said with a grain of salt here, but many other worldviews kind of play at this idea as well. And it's one of those things that where Christianity has moved away from this idea because they try to be different from other cultures and other religions, quote unquote. But In the sense of, okay, I gotta be careful how I word this. So, is I'm not promoting like other religions are correct in doing this. However, you cannot deny that the philosophy behind this is actually correct. And you think of like the old Chinese proverb, one often meets their fate on the road they take to avoid it. And the idea behind that is that things in life are just kind of preordained. And so it doesn't matter what you do, it doesn't matter what knowledge you have, things will play out a certain way. And so going with Paul here, it's kind of like that. So on the one hand, Paul's like, well, God has already led me to do ministry in all these Gentile places, but there's so much more God wants me to do. And so how that goes down, well, Paul's not totally sure. But as these other believers start getting these visions of like, oh no, things are going to go terrible if you go down to Jerusalem, Paul doesn't allow things like that to obstruct the calling that God has given him, but rather Paul kind of takes as an opportunity and says, well, maybe God will do something good out of it, because if God has called me to continue doing this ministry, then it doesn't matter what happens in Jerusalem, even with the accurate prophesying that Paul is going to run into trouble in Jerusalem. And what's interesting is there are multiple cases in chapter 21 where Paul is told basically that he's going to be taken prisoner in Jerusalem. And the first time when he's in Kos, or sorry, no, he's in okay, where'd they go first? They went to, they're in Tyre, and this is the beginning of the chapter. So they're in Tyre, and the believers there are the first ones to get this prophecy, but it's more vague that the the writer describes it here. It's kind of vague how they go about it, but it's like, oh, they're urging Paul not to go to Jerusalem because, led by the Spirit, they're kind of given an omen. I don't know how else you're gonna call it, but basically they're kind of given like omens about how like, oh no, like things are gonna go rough for you in Jerusalem. And then he gets a much more clearer picture when he goes to, I want to say, Caesarea. And they go to Caesarea, and while they're there, a guy shows up, and he does like the most weird ass thing. But it was to exemplify a point that the Spirit has spoken, and it's one of those things that like the Bible treats it a certain way, and I know in our modern day and age, we tend to be skeptical about these kind of things, and this is all the more reason that I always say like, this is why we always go to Scripture first whenever it comes to any kind of prophetic teaching and stuff like that, or people giving prophecies or whatever. Always go to Scripture. I strongly believe that. You always go to Scripture first to confirm anything that's been said and to make sure that it lines up. But and that's true about any of the crazy things I tell you, right? I always say go back to Scripture to make sure what I'm saying is accurate. Nothing wrong with a little weird anime spins here and there, but you always go to Scripture first. But at the same time, we read in the book of Acts here that how the Bible treats it is that the consistency of the prophecy is what validates it. It's not like Paul could check the scriptures and say like, am I going to have trouble in Jerusalem? It doesn't quite work like that. But the consistency of people warning Paul, oh, things are going to go badly, you go to Jerusalem. And then instead of running away from it, Paul's like, no, I'm not going to run away from it. One, I have a duty to go to Jerusalem. And secondly, if God has a particular calling. If he's done with that, then whatever, so be it. I mean, someone else will simply take his place, and Paul isn't wrong that someone else could just take his place. And then it leads to the next part of the story. But before we go into the part where Paul actually is in Jerusalem, there's some interesting aspects of the chapter, or this part of the chapter anyway, that I kind of want to point out. So I mentioned this already before, but I didn't go into it in a lot of detail. But you've kind of noticed that there's a lot of this first person usage. And this happens basically in this last arc a lot more. There was a little bit during Paul's missionary journeys, but you'll see it a lot more here, where there's this kind of first person, and the implication is that the writer, which we presume to be Luke, is included in the story, and he's an active character. And so another thing too, and this is where you have very different camps in this, and some scholars say, well, the inclusion of the first person makes it reliable information of what's happening, because we have a first witness account. And so by Paul including himself, it could say, or sorry, by Luke including himself, it could say that, like, well, yes, I saw these things happen, and so I'm writing this down as a viable witness. And in my writing of the book of Luke, I didn't like BS most of the stuff I wrote down, so I'm a trusty enough narrator. But of course, you have the other side that says, well, that first person adds too much bias, and that's an understandable critique and concern, that there's too much bias now in Paul's actions and how they're portrayed and whatnot and stuff like that. Because obviously they're friends, because otherwise they wouldn't be traveling together. And of course, there would be the good relations between them would add biases, and they can't be avoided. That you're not gonna write like how terrible your friend slash like mentor is. You're not gonna write that. You're not gonna write that they're terrible. And so the concern is that, like, if Luke doesn't write that way, then maybe all the stuff said about Paul may not be true, because it might just be embellished by their friendship. But either way, I mean, once again, you can go between the two sides, and both sides have merit, and both sides also don't complete the picture. So I mean, obviously there's some of both. But at the same time, I think what is interesting about the inclusion of the first person is that it adds this kind of dimension of, even though Paul was a super successful, ministry leader, you think of like your Joel Osteens and other megachurch pastors, and at times, and of course this is where the critique of those like megachurch pastors, especially the TV ones, come in, is that like they can feel so disconnected. They're kind of out there, and the rest of us average Christians are just a bunch of plebs, right? No one gives a damn about us, kind of thing. But I think the inclusion of the first person in the book of Acts shows that even though Paul is this super successful missionary leader, he's still just a guy that they hang out with. And I think that's something that many a church leaders also need to be reminded of, that we're just guys, and we need people like the Lukes in our lives that they just hang out with us, and we are just people. And sure, like Luke may have his biases, but that's because that they're friends, and there's an actual relational aspect to it, which is an important. I mean, that would, if there wasn't real like friendships and relationships that Paul wasn't building in his missionary trip, that would defeat the whole purpose of the missionary trip. So I mean, you just gotta take it that way. And I think the inclusion of the first person shows that kind of intimacy between friends, and it another thing too that I mentioned a while back was that, you know, Paul had a little bit of his own maturing to do, especially with his perspective on John Mark and somewhat missing the point of the gospel at times, where he's not willing to give Mark a second chance. But here, you know, Paul is the point of the gospels. You know, you would hope so that with Paul being as successful as he is at convincing people that Jesus was the Messiah, that he would understand the gospel and start really living it. And I like to think that this inclusion of the first person that is happening, because there is a much stronger relational dimension in Paul's ministry that was absent. You know, when you read in the earlier parts of Paul's ministry, you don't really see it that much because it's kind of like treated like it's business. But there's a much stronger relational aspect to Paul's ministry. And this kind of Paul's got a bunch of traveling companions kind of thing really adds to that. And of course, you know, one of the things that's also kind of nice is that he goes to these places and he's like meeting up with fellow Christians in the area and just like, hey, you know, let's just hang out. I want to get to know you guys, see what you guys are up to, and you guys can also check me out. It's a lot more vulnerability and transparency there, and I think that shows real growth in Paul's character. And I think that's kind of what's really neat about it. All right, so I'm just gonna skip forward a little bit and go to this part where, well, okay, before I actually go to the part I want to talk about, we're actually we are reintroduced to a character that we haven't seen in like a while, since like what, Acts chapter 8, and this is Philip, and the Bible specifies which Philip it is, and it's the one of the seven. So that means he was one of the seven parachurch leaders, I guess you could say, chosen back in Acts chapter, was it Acts chapter 6, where they, you know, we had a time skip and there was the whole parachurch thing was needed to help feed, you know, the poor. And one of the seven was, one of the leaders was a guy named Philip, and they were kind of the seven. Of course, it's funny that they say he's one of the seven, because remember, one of the seven was like martyred pretty early. And I think there's a kind of interesting interaction here, because, you know, Paul is directly responsible for this kind of turn of events in Philip's life. Well, okay, maybe Paul not himself was directly responsible, but Paul was part of the people that caused all this stuff to happen. But you know what's interesting that the Bible does is it kind of shows you that, like, no, you know, like, sure, things can be rough in life, but God can make things good. And I think what's really interesting about introducing Philip here is that it's supposed to kind of give us a sense of ease and peace when we know that, okay, if people are talking about like stuff, you know, stuff's gonna go down in Jerusalem with Paul, well, even if bad things happen, God can make things work for good and work for his glory. And I think by Paul meeting Philip here, I think there's a reassurance of that, because Philip probably had, like, you know, he thought he was gonna be like, oh, you know, I'm like, God had given me a pretty great position, being, you know, one of the leaders, one of the leaders of this parachurch organization to feed the poor, and, you know, we're really gonna do great stuff in Jerusalem. You know, that's probably what Philip was thinking when he first started that position, you know, way back. And remember, this is like years and years later. But, you know, back then Philip was probably thinking like, oh, you know, like, this is how I'm gonna be like serving God and spreading the gospel. But that quickly gets uprooted when Stephen is martyred. And so, you know, these guys, Philip and Paul, are actually somewhat connected because of Stephen. And so it's interesting that they finally have this encounter, and Philip serves as this kind of comfort to, no matter what happens, God will turn things for good. And I like to think that, this is not explicitly said so in the Bible. So this is kind of me like thinking this might be the case and hopeful, a little bit of optimism in the story is that, and the Bible doesn't disclose whether like Philip tells Paul any of this, but basically it's like, yeah, like when you guys martyred Stephen and caused that whole like uproar and forced many Christians to leave Jerusalem. At first it seemed like it was pretty bad at the time, but look at all the stuff God has done. Like all these churches being built all over the Mediterranean, and of course Paul himself being converted and leading many to Christ. And so, it's one of those things that like you don't think about how much God can do, no matter like you started with like evil intent, killing Stephen. And then even when we look here in Acts 21, Philip has a pretty good life now. He gets to live comfortably in Caesarea. Arguably, helped the dude start the Coptic church. And God has done a lot for Philip ever since. And I like to think that it brings this reassurance that no matter what happens, God, in God's sovereignty, God will make things good and make things work out. Now it's not like it's not a one-to-one always the case, kind of like God will always make things better, and like this life will always be great, and that's all the more reason why, we ultimately put our trust in, Jesus and the resurrection. And so the resurrection is the ultimate culmination of like, yes, things will get better. But at least we read here in chapter 21 that by meeting Philip here and seeing that, he's got a nice family and he's possibly leading a lot of believers in Caesarea, that God has done a lot with Philip. And for Paul to see that, even though Paul may have been the cause of some misery in his life, it's like, no, God can make life better, and God can turn all kinds of opportunity to good. I mean, we've read through many parts of the book of Acts where like more people are saved when crazy stuff happens, and as I like to word it now, is that God makes the miracles happen through chaos and then brings order, as opposed to what many people expect is God will just make things orderly. Because anytime, people get the easy way, chaos comes after it. And, we've read stuff with like when Paul was in Philippi, I think it is. And, he heals a girl and then there's chaos. But then when he's in prison, an earthquake happens and then people are converted to Christianity, right? So it's kind of weird like that. And I think having Philip show up here and how good his life is now, I think it shows that like, yes, God can use all kinds of chaos to create opportunity. And how does Sun Tzu say it, right? Where there is chaos, there is always opportunity. And so finally we get to the part that I did want to talk about. This hilarious scene. It's just so weird, but it's hilarious. So we get this dude named Agabus, and he shows up. Now, what's interesting is the Bible mentions that he came from Judea. And so the implication is that he might have been around Jerusalem, and you gotta take this with like, a little bit, where like, is it really the Spirit speaking? Is it or maybe Agabus is a smart guy? Obviously, it's a mix of both. But this interesting kind of factor that like he's from Judea, so it's very possible he may also have like heard rumors and stuff like that. about what would happen to Paul. And so, if you put that into account, you might feel like, okay, then it's not like so supernatural that Agabus has this like very um, strongly illustrated prophetic word for Paul, where like what's he do? He walks up to the guy, he whips off his belt, which must have been weird as all heck, right? Like you walk up to a dude and like unclip his belt and just pull his belt out of his pants. Might even, the guy might drop his pants. I mean, okay, obviously it's different back then. They weren't wearing like pants like we do, and belts don't serve the same purpose. But he takes this dude's belt off, and then what's he do? He ties himself up with it. Well, that's just weird, right? Like tying yourself up with someone else's belt. That's like, never mind. We won't go there. But it's weird. It's weird. And then like as he's like laying there tied up, because somehow Agabus ties himself up. How does it even work? How do you tie yourself up like that? And can a belt possibly be long enough to do that? I don't know. I mean, maybe Paul was a fat guy and had a huge belt at this point. Paul is an old guy at this point, so I mean it's very possible. But he manages to tie himself up with his belt, and then while he's like tied up and he's laying there. I mean, I assume he'd be lying down if he's tied up. It'd be hard to tie yourself while standing and stay standing, right? Especially when, as the Bible says, he ties his hands and feet. So yeah, it says he ties his own. This is verse 11, by the way. He ties his own hands and feet with one belt. So I assume he's like lying down, like to do this, because it'd be weird if he was like bent over, like and then he gives this like prophetic word about how like, oh, the owner of this belt, which is kind of like a duh moment. I mean, he did just take off Paul's belt while Paul was still wearing it. And then to say it like as ominously as like the owner of this belt will be tied up just like this and be handed over to the Gentiles. Now, what's interesting about this, when Agabus uses this phrasing, and I think this is where like the next part makes a lot more sense. So the wording Agabus uses is, in this way the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem will bind the owner of this belt and will hand him over to the Gentiles. And the wording is clearly very intentional, and it's supposed to stir up certain feelings. And the next part, when you read it, it kind of sounds really obvious then, that like, well, of course people don't want Paul to go to Jerusalem because of what would happen if Paul did. And the close parallel is with, of course, Jesus himself. And so Jesus has, excuse me, first year on of the stream, Jesus also spoke of himself that way when, prophesying his own death, that he would be handed over to the Gentiles. And so this wording Agabus uses from the Jewish leaders handing Paul over to the Gentiles, it carries that same kind of weight. And obviously the Christians were like, oh, we don't want this to happen, because it would, be like the same kind of injustice that happened to Christ himself. And of course it makes that weird parallel with like Paul and Christ. But of course, Paul comes with a super brave statement of like, well then, all the more reason, that I can be more like Christ if I go through the same death processes. I mean, that's a weird way of looking at it, but it's like, yeah, to be more like Christ, that would be an honor. That's probably what Paul is thinking. And so I just found that part kind of interesting, because for Agabus to come to Judah, which means he likely got word that people were plotting this, which also shows that, how uncreative people can be. Is like, we're going to do the same thing to this guy that we did to like another guy that I think would actually ended up causing problems for them, because, by handing Jesus over to the authorities, and then Jesus being handed over to the Gentiles to be executed. Isn't that what started the whole Christian movement thing in the first place? So, kind of like, like, not these Jewish guys not thinking this through very well, because, at worst, they create a new cult. At best, that would undeniably, change the entirety of Jerusalem to Christianity, which obviously we did not get that option. So, but it's very interesting that, like, yeah, there's this close parallel with Jesus, and when you think about it like that, it's like, well, the last thing you would want to do then is to execute this guy, because then it would just make the Christian movement even bigger. And I thought the whole point was that, like, no, I thought these guys wanted to stifle out Christianity, but by doing this, it would actually just empower them. But then, of course, the twist is that this doesn't happen. So Christianity goes a different route, if you will, and that's by going to Rome and continually spreading through the Gentile world. The whole make disciples of all nations thing. But I don't know. I just thought that'd be kind of funny. That, like, yeah, these guys didn't think this part through very well, because the last thing you want to do is make more martyrs. I mean, that's how by making more martyrs like this is how, like, you get more people into the movement. It's just, I don't know, it's just funny like that. And then Paul's response is great, right? He's just like, all the more reason to do it. To be more like Jesus, awesome. Not that we should be seeking out our own martyrdoms, but at the same time, it's like, well, I guess if people want to try and kill you to stop the movement because they're scared of what you can do, I guess, it is a massive ego stroke. It's like, yeah, clearly you're doing something right if people are out to kill you like that. And, as I read this, I think about something. And it's one of those things that, like, now I know there's many other, even Christians out there that may be on the naysayer side and be like, oh, the end is closer than you think it is. But, like, at the same time, it's like, well, no, hold up here. I mean, first of all, the end could be literally any time, so that's not relevant. But something that has me thinking is, you see all these forces in the world and how antagonistic toward Christianity. And, it's one of those things that, like, and I've mentioned this before, where, like, maybe what we need is, like, more things to go wrong, because then it will make people realize how wrong things are when people start really screwing up their own lives. And then maybe that will push them to seek the gospel. In that same vein, I kind of feel that, like, that's where Christianity will always be at its strongest, I think, is when there are those who try to suppress it. There are those who try to fight against it and try to, do away with the gospel and whatever. It's like, no. You cannot do away the word of life like that. The word of life doesn't just cower away into the darkness like that. After all, it's life. And that is ultimately culminated in the person of Jesus Christ. And so, you can't just make Jesus go away like that. It doesn't work. And the more people try to suppress it, the more people try to do whatever they can to snuff out Jesus and his message, that only allows him, if you will, to achieve his goals. That first happened when they literally killed Jesus, and that's prophecy fulfilled. How about that? And of course the whole Chinese proverb, we meet our destiny on the road we take to avoid it. And so, these people thinking like, oh, we just do away with this Jesus guy, and then he'll go away. And it's like, nope, just fulfilled messianic prophecy. Good job, guys. And so, even in this world where, it's so easy to feel that like, oh, the culture and all that is against God, and so it looks as if like, Christianity is gonna get pushed out and whatnot, but it's like, no, wrong. It is in those moments that like, and it also shows you that like, okay, let's be real. Like all these movements that try to stifle out Christianity, they all do the same boring tactic. And let's be real, it's been tried once, it's been tried many a times, but Christianity has only kept growing. And yeah, there'll always be like failures in, there's ups and downs in, development of Christianity and its growth. But with that said, we are bound for a spike right back up. And, I think that's what the Lord is really seeking, in that He wants more of us to be saved. And so I think this spike here would be a huge opportunity for that. And that's something that would bring the Lord great joy, that many people will come to believe, many will come to repent of their sin, and so on. Because, these people come up with plans to try and stifle our Christianity, but it will only make the gospel message that much stronger. And I think that's kind of, when you read through Acts 21 like this, I kind of think about that, because you think of these guys that are trying to like, oh, we do whatever we can to stifle and snuff out, these Christians, this weird cult group. But no, all it'll do is just make them stronger. And yeah, that's the other thing too. And this is, once again, it goes back to that biblical principle of, well, even when people intend things for evil, God will make things work for His good and the greater glory. And so we may not notice it at the time. And I mean, that's the fundamental story of many Bible characters. I mean, Joseph is the prime example. And of course, that's why, many a Bible scholar tells us like these guys are all proto-Christ characters. Of course, it's kind of weird to call Paul a proto-Christ because, he's not a before. But he's definitely an after. So an epichrist. But anyway, basically, we share in that Christ experience, if you will. And at the time, it feels like, oh, the world is so against us, the darkness is so great. But, that's how Jesus overcame the world. That's how Jesus overcame sin, was when it looked so dark, when it was like the moment of defeat. That was when Jesus overcame it. And that's, of course, why the resurrection is the say all be all. And so, going back with Paul here in the book of Acts, I think there's that, like, yes, understanding that spirit of God will always make things work for His good. So no matter what these guys plot, God will turn something great out of it. And I think there's the microcosm bit with like seeing Philip and this new life that he has and how good it's actually kind of been for him. Yeah, he's got a bunch of kids, means he met a nice girl and got busy. And so, I mean, that's great enough already. And so, to know that, like, yes, God can do all kinds of things, even in adversity. And then on a larger scale, well, even if people try to stifle out the missionary work of Paul, well, who knows? God could make him do a lot more work in the missionary world. Spoilers, he does. But even in basic, what am I trying to get at here? Well, basically is that even though in our present time we feel like, oh, like that, it's so crushing, these forces against us, against the gospel at times. They seem so overwhelming, but the fact of the matter is, Christ will use those opportunities to always overcome. that's what he always does. So, just like as we read in the gospel itself, as well as we read here with Paul, and you can see that in your own life, and that's something that I like to encourage you with, is that, yeah, no matter what may come, as we trust in Christ, then with him we can overcome. And of course that's kind of the implication that you read, like the letters of John, for instance, and that's exactly what John talks about. That through the blood of Christ we overcome. Anyway, we gotta move on here because it's already been an hour and I'm only halfway through chapter 21. So next we get to Paul actually in Jerusalem. Now this part we'll kind of speed through because of course like it'll be relevant again. Oh, excuse me, as you read through chapter 22, and chapter 22 is really just like a speech, so there's not a lot we have to dig into, but basically Paul gets to Jerusalem, and it's kind of this funny thing where like, okay, so he goes to the church and he reports to them, and they're like, okay, yeah, that's all great, but now there's some odd rumors going on about you. Now we know they're obviously groundless, but we kind of want to make sure that like we don't want to cause trouble. And this is where it's one of those weird things where like the Bible says like, okay, it's okay to do a little bit of people pleasing, because even though Christians are all about subverting the culture, Christians aren't about going around picking fights. And so what's interesting is that the church suggests, you know what, we're gonna play along and we'll have you go to this like cleansing ritual. And with that, as you pay homage and stuff like that, and you do live well with Jewish customs, so once you show that to them, there shouldn't be a problem. And I know some people would say like, well, that's just the church trying to people please, and people pleasing is bad. But I mean, on the one hand, it's like, well, obviously, you always live to people please in some sense. Because I mean, think of it like this, like, see, I think this is where like the bad connotations of people pleasing, like when you say people pleasing, people assume the negative connotations of like always caving into other people despite their irrational demands or something like that, or not living for yourself because you should always put yourself first, kind of thing. But of course, that the flip side is, well, putting yourself first is actually bad. And so we do live to people please, and you do live to serve others and to make other people's lives better. You don't live for just you. And so the old Homer Simpson joke, I've made this joke already on the channel, but basically there's that one part, this is one episode where Homer, he has this crazy idea of mixing drinks. Can't remember what he was going to drink, and Marge tells him this is a terrible idea, and then Homer's response was, well, that's a problem for future Homer. And so what's hilarious and brilliant about that is, if you really think about it, like, future you isn't you. It's basically a different person. And that's the same with past you. Past you is a different person, which is also why cancel culture is stupid, because you're not the person, even if you said some bad things in the past and made offensive jokes in the past or whatever. Like I've done that, and anyone who says they haven't committed let me put it this way: anyone who says they haven't said bad things in the past, question them, because that ain't normal. All of us have done it. But at the same time, well, past you is not you. That's not who you are now. And so, in a way, you don't live for just yourself. Even like your past and future you treat them like they're different people. You treat them like they're other people. And so, in the grand scheme of things, you don't live for just you. You live to serve others. You live to please others. Not to an excessive point of like, well, you disregard your personal health. That's different. You can't disregard your personal health. You can't disregard living with integrity, and you don't put people over God, of course not. But at the same time, you do live the people please, and with a healthy amount. Like for instance, every husband's he lives to serve his wife, and so he is every husband's a people pleaser, because you know that is a good ticket to having sex later. So like, people pleasing good. And so like, when you go to work and you do want to do a good job to please your boss and be a people pleaser, you want to be in good favor with them, because one, you don't want to get fired. Secondly, you don't know if there's chances of promotion, stuff like that, because you're doing a good job, and you're doing what you can to please your employer. Think about like, um, when you make friends, and what kind of friends you pick is like the people that let me put it this way. So the kind of friends you pick are people who are easy to please, and are grateful when you are people pleasing, because then it creates this dynamic of, we can actually get along, we can actually live in harmony together, and that's the idea of community and friendships. And so in a way, we always live to people please, but at the same time, once again, there is such a thing as too much. And of course, you can't put people pleasing over, not just, personal health. And of course, there are priorities within people pleasing. So for instance, you know doing the will of God is a form of people pleasing, because God is a person, you're pleasing God. So that's a form of people pleasing, and that is the number one priority of people pleasing. Any married couple would tell you that the the spouse is pretty high on the priority list. You don't people please other people over your spouse, and stuff like that. So I mean, obviously there's a hierarchy within that, but at the same time, I think it's really stupid when people try to disregard the entire premise of people pleasing. Because once again, I think when you use the phrase like people pleasing, it like people just automatically assume all the negative connotations of that, which is wrong to do. We live to people please, but in a good way though, in a good way, because once again, think of it this way: there's everybody wants to be liked, and there's nothing wrong with doing things to be liked by other people. There's nothing wrong with that in a vacuum, because once again, you should go through life wanting to be liked, because first of all, it's good for your mental health. It's an essential part of survival. You think of like the ancient world, and people making like weird ass alliances here and there, and who they side with and whatnot. Like, no, that all comes from this idea of, well, you know who do I make good friends with? Who do I please, so that I don't run into trouble later? And so there's stuff like that you have to consider. And so once again, I guess what I'm trying to get at here is, I'm trying to dispel like the notion that people pleasing is all bad, because it's not. Uh, but at the same time, of course, once again, it's got to be healthy. You just got to be smart about it. Going back to, okay, then we got to go back to the passage here. But basically, there's nothing wrong with the church doing a little bit of people pleasing. Okay? Now there's a difference between like, okay, we're not going to be overly judgmental because we want you to like us. And it's funny, I was watching this video that came out a couple days ago. It just kind of showed on my feed, and I was like, oh, that's an interesting title, so I want to see what it's up about. And please, Dr. Peterson, notice me. But it will add popularity to my channel, please. But anyway, Dr. Jordan Peterson was talking about it was a message to the Christian church, and fundamentally what his message was, and there's some parts of it where I kind of disagree with him, because ultimately, the purpose of the church is to bring enlightenment through the God, like the God, bringing enlightenment with the gospel, and the gospel being, you know, true enlightenment, and that's kind of the true purpose of the church. But I totally get what he was getting. And so basically in the video, he was talking about how something churches have failed to do was to culminate within men, you know, their responsibility. And I get behind that mostly, that how do I put this? Yes, we as the church, we are supposed to cultivate people being responsible. Of course, that's not the end all be all, because of course, more importantly, the better way of looking at it is we are supposed to be conducting ourselves as we are accountable to Jesus Christ. And so that responsibility thing kind of goes with that. But as Peter, well, once again, Peterson was like, wow, this is like a 7-minute video, so he can't go in like huge detail into it. Like me talking about it now is gonna take more than 7 minutes. So I mean, I'll give the guy a bit of the benefit of the doubt. But basically, one of the things I noticed that he is right on the money on is that I think one of the major problems churches generally have, and it's not just Christian churches, lots of other religious organizations do this too, because I think it's part of the problem is that like the way culture tries to suppress and say that like, oh, keep your religious beliefs to yourself, you know, you know, your religion is a private thing, and so don't go around talking about it all the time, which is dumb, because your beliefs dictate your behavior. So there's that. So if I'm not, and of course, you know, this is where the, you know, the accountability thing before God, but also before people, is something that the church is meant to be fostering more of. But anyway, Peterson was talking about in that video about how the church ought to inspire men to take up responsibility. And then he was making like, you know, things you could do, you know, advertise and say like, young men welcome here kind of thing. And I thought that part was actually pretty good, where he was like, yes, you know, everybody should, you know, we got to be inviting everybody to church and be very bold about it. That part I totally agree with. And I agree with like parts about how, yes, you know, there's a lot of men who are disenfranchised, and the church should be the place that says you are welcome here. If the world doesn't welcome you here, then the church does. And of course, and Peterson didn't outright say this, but a big reason for that is like, well, if the world won't accept you, you know that you always have, like, God is willing to accept you. You know, stuff like that. But something I got from his video was that, you know, something churches just suck at doing, because, you know, many people have that negative stigma of like church is always against like just bad mouthing the culture and whatever. But something churches should be doing is you gotta people please a little bit, so that, you know, you gotta make people like you, and you gotta make sure that you don't cause trouble, because, you know, what kind of message does that send, where it's like Jesus wants to save you, but then all you do is cause trouble? People are not going to get the idea that Jesus wants to save us from sin if all you do is cause trouble. And so, going back to the passage now, there's nothing wrong. I'm basically making a big defense here of why there is nothing wrong with the church doing this with Paul and telling him, okay, we need to come up with this plan to please the crowds. Because on the one hand, you might think, well, couldn't they just say like, no, F you, we do what we want? Of course, you know, this is the first century, not the 21st century. So you can't just tell people that like my religious beliefs are my religious beliefs and I don't have to do what you have to say. That would never fly, especially in the first century. And so, you know, with that said, the church is being wise here, and I am defending how the church behaves here in the Book of Acts. That they will do a bit of people pleasing because they don't want to cause trouble. You know, they just want to be a bunch of good guys, share the gospel, and lead people to life. You know, lead people to Christ. They don't want to cause trouble. And so, there's these accusations, and they're like, you know what, we'll show them that you're not breaking the laws of Moses. You're still a strong Jewish practitioner. So just go out there and do Jewish things and people please a little bit. And I'm totally with the church's side on that. There's nothing wrong with doing a little bit of that. And we read in crap. See, I always get the later letters of Paul always mixed up because they all kind of blended together at this point. But pretty sure it's in Philippians of like, I am a Jew for the Jews, a Greek for the Greek, and so on. And so the idea is, yes, you do a bit of people pleasing so that you can share the gospel. And there's nothing wrong with the church doing this. To do a little bit of people pleasing. I think it's totally acceptable. But with that said, even though the church tried to people please a little bit, see, this is the reason why people tell you not to people please. Now, of course, I just went through this whole thing of defending, like, it's okay to do some people pleasing. But, of course, there's a good reason why you shouldn't people please. At least not, like, hardcore. It's because, let's be real, you can never really please people. Because if you do one thing right, someone else will just pick out something else to say that's wrong with you. And that's exactly what happens here. So, Paul doing Jewish things, being a good Jew, people pleasing, doing the rites and the helping these guys with their religious vows and stuff like that. No, Paul not being a problem. But then what? People start making other crap about him. Like, oh, you defiled the temple by bringing a Gentile here. Just because they saw Paul hanging with some Greek guy, like, outside, just kind of chilling out in town. Because once again, this is where I guess the people against people pleasing have a point here, where it's like, well, you can never really make people happy because they'll always find something wrong. They'll always find something to criticize. I get that. I mean, that's the reason why you don't overcommit to people pleasing. So basically what I'm saying is, okay, you gotta do some people pleasing because you gotta get people to like you. At the same time, the fact is, there's nothing wrong with you trying to get people to like you. Because there will always be people who won't like you. There are people who are just going to be assholes about it. Okay? I'll give you an anecdote. There were people, even Christian people, that I was always nice. I was always like, not just nice, that's a shitty way of putting it. I was always really fervent in, showing that I cared about them, being a great guy. I showed that, like, I have a lot of very good masculine quality. You guys see where I'm going with this. And, thanks to a shitty ideology called feminism, women cannot look at a guy being good to them without assuming that there's an ulterior motive. I mean, I guess there is when a guy's like, hey, I kind of like you, so I'm going to be, like, a really good guy in front of you. And, in a sense, there's nothing wrong with me people-pleasing and, like, because I'm being nice to people, I'm helping people, I'm, not being a dick. And stuff like that. But at the same time, there are some people that just be like, no, I'm going to assume you have ulterior motives. And bad ulterior motives. Which is where the feminism thing comes in. Because, feminism has poisoned Christian women to assume that any man, even a half-decent Christian guy, will always have bad ulterior motives when they're being nice to women. It's like, I guess there's no such thing as being nice to women because, God commands us to be good to people. No, the assumption is, no, clearly the guy has ulterior motives to sleep with you. And so, it's like, okay, like, maybe after marriage, I mean, that would be completely normal. But, like, there's that, basically what I'm getting at is there are people you can't please because they're already poisoned with kind of like mindsets that will never accept any good you do and any people pleasing you do. They cannot accept it. I use the feminism thing as like an easy example because it happens all the freaking time to young men. So, going back to Jordan Peterson's thing, right? This is why churches need to help guys out, okay? Because a lot of young men, here's my 2 cents on, a lot of the stuff Jordan Peterson says. It's like, yeah, he's not wrong about his criticism of modern society that puts down young men. Because people are just trained to always assume that anything a young guy does is always with like really shitty ulterior motives. Like, no, that's not true. That's not always the case. Not everybody is Tosi Baruka, okay? Not everybody is Vosh. Those are two complete different extremes. But you get the point. Not everybody is out there for themselves. Okay? It's just, or let me not. That's not the right way. But not every guy is out there with like extreme self worship, basically. Not everybody's like that. Okay, like chill out. And so, that's something that many women in the church need to learn too. Okay? When you do that to guys, you are being the exact same thing that you judge them of being. Overly selfish and massive ego. And so, just saying. But anyway, and I get the reality that like if you try to please people, there will always be people who cannot be pleased. And I've dealt with this. I've been helping people and people pleasing in some sense, and no amount of my good virtue would ever change someone's mind. You just gotta deal with that at times because there are people like that. You can't change how other people think. Only the Spirit can do that. But at the same time, just because there will be people out there that you can never please, that doesn't mean that you don't go out there and do what you can to please people and to make people's lives better. And to get people to like you, at the very least. Basically, nothing wrong with that, okay? Nothing wrong with that. In a vacuum, okay? Like, that's just part of human life. But Paul, this whole plan backfires because there are people who cannot be pleased, and these people find a reason to assault Paul. And what's kind of funny here, and it's kind of one of those things that like, it just, from a historical perspective, it kind of like, I hate to say it this way, but it justifies why like Rome had to sack Israel or Jerusalem in 70 AD. Like the Romans, as wrong as that was for them to like just blaze the place to the ground, at the same time you cannot help but like sympathize and be like, yes, the Romans had to do this. And that was because like, okay, so in the story what happens here is after Paul goes to the temple and he's trying to do like these purity rites stuff and being a good Christian and a good Jew, and then these people they try to hand Paul over to the Jewish authorities, and they're like, oh, they're having an uproar because like, oh, this guy, he's causing trouble in the Jewish world, spreading these other messages, going against the teaching of Moses, blah blah blah, and they then like basically assault this guy. Now we've read several times in the past that Paul is in fact, well, maybe not several times, at least once, in like for instance in chapter 16. Paul reveals that he's a Roman citizen. And so assaulting a Roman citizen can be a very serious charge, which is also why you had all these Roman guards around, because if there was a Roman citizen that would be assaulted by any one of like the occupied nations, well, that was just like asking for trouble. But yet here these Jewish people are not caring. Now Paul was being smart here by not immediately playing the I am a Roman citizen card, because if he did, then it would actually cause like there would actually be bloodshed, because then like a lot of these rioters would technically be could be executed on sight because they've committed a very serious legal crime, assaulting a Roman citizen. Especially a bunch of these Jewish guys who were not Roman citizens and may have had animosity toward Roman citizens. So if Roman guards caught people, assaulting Roman citizens, they may kill on sight. But that would just make things worse. You think about it. So Paul was smart in not playing the Roman citizenship card, which I know some people throw like that question of like, why didn't Paul do that here? Because he could have saved himself trouble. Like, no, Paul. But of course, there's that thing too. Paul isn't just thinking about himself. He's not, he's people pleasing a little bit. He's not thinking about just himself. He's thinking about the same people who would be his enemies, fellow Jews. He's thinking about the Romans. He doesn't want Romans to get their hands bloodied unnecessarily. So Paul, and this shows like a good, his good Christian virtue, that he really does care about other people. I'm just gonna skip this last part. So he does get arrested, and the Roman guard's like, "Oh, we gotta do something about this." So we're gonna just put Paul in a protected space inside the barracks, which I guess would be the safest place, because the place is loaded with Roman guards, so that's as safe as it's gonna be. And so they get Paul in there to protect him, and then Paul appeases to the commander there, which is interesting that Pilate is no longer around. Well, first of all, this is like 30 years later from Jesus, so Pilate may very well have retired and or died. So, but we have a new guy here. And then, of course, there's a funny thing in the Book of Acts where we go through different governors, but this commander guy, different guy, new guy, just like, oh, I gotta deal with Jewish insurrections again. And I made this joke with Pilate back in the Book of Luke, but dude, being a Roman, officer in a place like Jerusalem must have sucked ass. Must have been a terrible job. No wonder these guys always complain about it. But anyway, Paul appeals to this commander to allow him back out to speak to the people. And the commander's like, okay, I guess. I mean, what's he gonna do? Say no? But the guard's like, all right, you can speak to the people, whatever you want to say. And then Paul goes out, and he's going to give this speech that we're going to read in chapter 22. Before that, I know there was a lot I said there, so if you have any questions, just shoot. I'm going to take this sip of water. My throat is dry a little bit, so I got to take a short break here. Alrighty, chapter 22. Brothers and fathers, listen now to my defense. Now when they heard him speak to them in Aramaic, they became very quiet. I mean, yeah, he's a Jewish guy in a Jewish temple. What else would he be speaking? Then Paul said, I am a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city. I studied under Gamaliel, and was thoroughly trained in the law of our ancestors. I was just as zealous for God as any of you are today. I persecuted the followers of this way to their death, arresting both men and women and throwing them into prison. As the high priest and all the council can themselves testify, I even obtained letters from them to their associates in Damascus, and went there to bring these people as prisoners to Jerusalem to be punished. About noon I came near Damascus, and suddenly a bright light from heaven flashed around me. I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And who are you, Lord? I asked. I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting," he replied. "My companions saw the light, but they did not understand the voice of him who was speaking to me." "And what shall I do?" I asked. "Get up," the Lord said, "and go into Damascus, and there you will be told all that you have been assigned to do." My companions led me by the hand into Damascus, because the brilliance of the light had blinded me. Now a man named Ananias came to see me. He was a devout observer of the law and highly respected by all Jews living there. He stood beside me and said, "Brother Saul, receive your sight." And at that very moment I was able to see him. Then he said, "The God of our ancestors has chosen you to know his will, and to see the righteous one, and to hear words from his mouth. You will be his witness to all people of what you have seen and have heard. And now what are you waiting for? Get up and be baptized, and wash your sins away, calling on his name." When I returned to Jerusalem and was praying at the temple, I fell into a trance and saw the Lord speaking to me. "Quick," he said, "leave Jerusalem immediately, because the people here will not accept your testimony about me." "Lord," I replied, "these people know that I went from one synagogue to another to imprison and beat those who believe in you. And when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I stood there, giving my approval, and guarded the clothes of those who were killing him." Then the Lord said to me, "Go, I will send you far away to the Gentiles." Now the crowd listened to Paul until he had said this. Then they raised their voices and shouted, "Rid the earth of him! He is not fit to live!" And as they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust into the air, the commander ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. He directed that he be flogged and interrogated in order to find out why the people were shouting at him like this. As they stretched him out to flog him, Paul said to the centurion standing there, "Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty?" When the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and reported it. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "This man is a Roman citizen." The commander went to Paul and asked, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" "I am," Paul answered. Then the commander said, "I had to pay a lot of money for my citizenship." "Yeah, well, I was born a citizen," Paul replied. Now those who were about to interrogate him withdrew immediately. The commander himself was alarmed when he realized that he had put Paul, a Roman citizen, in chains. The commander wanted to find out exactly why Paul was being accused by the Jews. So the next day, he released him and ordered the chief priests and all members of the Sanhedrin to assemble. Then he brought Paul and had him stand before them. What a wicked cliffhanger to end on. But yeah, so chapter 22, there's really not a lot to dissect in this chapter, because a lot of it is just like retelling an earlier part of the book of Acts. But of course, the way that it's written is just like all from Paul's perspective, as opposed to like a more like narrative perspective, like a narrator narrating it. And so, Paul just kind of talks about how like, the life that he was living, his conversion to Christianity sometime later, and yada yada yada. And there's really nothing else to add here. Not until we get to the ending of the speech, which I do want to point out something. So, Paul brings up that something that we didn't know, that wasn't flat out said to us about like Paul's perspective on ministry, and something that kind of, you know, allows us to get a little insight into like how much Paul has grown. But even Paul had his doubts about the ministry work, and I think that one makes him relatable, because I mean every person in ministry does have their doubts. And this is shown when Paul talks about how, oh, you know, like, what can I do now after he returns to Jerusalem? Because he's like, well, no one, you know, no one will accept my testimony and my conversion to Christianity, because, you know, people remember who I was. You know, the guy who killed or was there at someone else, you know, at the killing of a believer. And I was a person that persecuted the church. So how would anyone believe me? How would anyone, you know, trust what I say? But then what's interesting about this is that I think there's something that, you know, especially in the world today, you know, people, we live in a world where we're forced to tiptoe because of anything we say and do in the past may come back to bite us. And, you know, there are parts of it that will. There are some parts of like, yeah, you know, your past does play a big part on who you've become. But at the same time, you cannot be shackled by it. You cannot, and more importantly, people cannot shackle you to the past. They can't just bring up that like, well, you are like this, so how could you ever be? How could you ever be better? And so in Paul's case, it's like, well, you are the cause of many Christians' death. How could you ever really be one yourself? How could you lead other people to Christ? You know, how could you go around, in a sense, creating people that you yourself, you know, destroyed? And, you know, that is a question worth pondering. But what what God reveals is that like, well, I can always find a use for you. I can send you to the Gentiles. You know, there will always be a place for the gospel. Doesn't matter who's saying it. Doesn't matter what you did in the past. You know, God God has called all of us to make disciples. Doesn't matter what kind of people we were in the past. And I've mentioned this before, but like there's even people I look up to that were pretty awful people in the past. But you know, it doesn't matter now. It doesn't matter who they once were. It's who they are now. And that's something that I think we've lost a lot of sight of. And of course, you know, you think of like, I think that's why there's so much nihilism, especially in like young people. It's because like there's so much of our culture revolves around kind of not making. I know this sounds like contradictory to something I said before, but there's this cultural attitude of like making the past not matter. You know, time is fleeting. You just do whatever you want that makes you feel good because that's the only thing you can know. But at the same time, it's like, no, who you are now, this is what you're stuck with. And you have to make the best of it. Because you do have to use what you have now to make sure other people are better off, including future you, who's technically another person. Because, you know, you don't know who you're going to be. And so in the present, you do whatever you can to make other people's lives better. And so, with that said, I think that's a lot of the nihilism that we have in society today, especially in young people, is that attitude isn't cultivated. You know, no one is really told to like, you are to live to make other people's lives better, and of course your own life better as well. But you live to move forward and to create improvements. That's how you should be living, but no one really thinks that. It's just do whatever I want and doesn't matter of the consequences, as opposed to always think about what improvements can be made. And so, going back with Paul here, I think that's kind of how the gospel, that's part of the testimony of the gospel, is that like, well, who has God made me to be today? And how is God moving me forward? How is God, making me grow and shaping me and moving in that direction? And to be optimistic in that too. But of course, once again, the culture in the world today is to just bar down all optimism with cynicism. But I think that's where, once again, all the more reason we need the the gospel, because the gospel restores hope in life, as opposed to if you just live, the hedonistic way today. There, all that, all that leads to is just, the weariness of the bones and to self decay, if you're not seeking life to restore yourself. And so, I think that's something that is lost in people today, and that's also why people are so lost. It's because there isn't that hope built into them, that like, even if you remove God out of the equation for a minute, there's there's no hope to move forward in your own life to make things better. Now, putting the God element back in, and what God can do with your life, and the many things that He can, and the things that He could allow for you to, move forward. And so, we read this bit with Paul, and Paul has his doubts here about how, how could God, how could I be used to proclaim the gospel? I was once an enemy of it. But it's like, well, who you were then, it's not who you are now. Who you are now, is a believer and a follower of Christ and a lover of God. So do that. And God will find the ways of which you can do those things. And so it's, Paul ends his speech with like, well, he doesn't end the speech, he gets interrupted. But the speech ends with, God saying, well, I can use you to, serve the Gentiles and to bring Gentiles to faith. Of course, the funny thing is that the people get mad about that part. Like, the whole rest of the speech, they don't get mad about that Paul converted to Christianity. Well, whatever, right? The people don't get mad about that. They get mad at the part where like Paul's like, yeah, and then God called me to minister to the Gentiles. But it's interesting here is that it shows, and once again, it's one of those funny things and sad, where like, I guess it's justified. Once again, you feel like, as terrible as it was for Rome to like just sack Jerusalem and burn the place down in 70 AD, you feel like they're, when you read passages like this, you feel like they're pretty justified in doing that, because it's like, God has called me to give the gospel to the Gentiles, and that's the thing that pisses the Jews off, right? And then what does that tell the Romans? It's like, what? You hate us so much that like the idea of God being nice to us is an affront to you? Well, you know, screw you guys and screw your religion. And that's kind of how many people have that attitude toward Christians today. And that's the danger of why, like, why as Christians we need to be much more like, no, we are about helping all people and leading all people to Christ. You cannot be discriminant in that. But it was just one of those funny things where, like, yeah, no wonder the Romans would hate the Jews, especially when, like, the Jews get mad that God would say, I want you to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. And that's what pisses off the Jews. And by extension, that really pisses off the Romans. I mean, I would feel, I mean, to be fair, for the Roman, if I were, like, a Roman there, and that's what I saw, I'd be pretty mad about that, so. The people get into a fit. And then Paul is brought into the barracks and he's about to get tortured because they're like, "All right, what did you do?" And see, this is one of the funny things too, where it's like, this is how it shows you how brutal the Romans are. So I guess like, it's this weird back and forth of like, the Romans feel justified because of the amount of racism that the Jews have. So let me word that better. The Romans are completely justified in their animosity toward the Jews because of the Jews' blatant racism. But then the Jews are justified in their racism against the Romans because of how brutal and inhumane the Romans act. And so we read here where like the Romans are like, instead of just asking questions of like, what did you do that pissed off the Jews so much, Paul? They don't just ask him. No, instead they tie him up and they're ready to like torture chamber this guy to make him talk. It's like, I guess you can't just ask the guy if he's gonna talk at the get-go. No, we gotta beat the shit out of him first. Then we know he'll start talking. Which is kind of really backwards if you think about it. It's one of those things about like interrogation methods. It's kind of stupid where it's like, torturing someone in reality, and this is one of those things about like movies that tell you like it's just flat out wrong that movies do this. Like, torturing someone will not make someone tell the truth. Torturing somebody would make them spit in your face and say, "Go F yourself." I'm not telling you shit, is what would happen. Like, here's the thing too. We're like, okay, let's say, in movies where like, oh, the guys in like like, okay, there's a difference between like an interrogation scene and then like a torture scene to like get information out of somebody. And so if you were to torture somebody, you're not going to get information out of them. And some movies, they actually like have the bad guys sometimes get their way because like, well, of course, good people will like, okay, I'll cave in and I'll tell you what you need, but like, don't hurt the ones I love kind of thing. But then of course, like, realistically, that's stupid because bad people will hurt them anyway because they're bad people. That's what makes them evil. But, and an interrogation is a little different where like you're just grilling someone with questions and you're being a little bit bad copy. That's a little different. But like, if you're gonna try and torture someone for information, don't expect it to work. Because if you're gonna like torturing somebody to try and get information, will only make them not want to tell you because they'll be like, once again, they just tell you to go screw yourself. And so, when the Romans act this way, yeah, it's no wonder people hated the Romans. It's no wonder the Jews were so racist toward them. Because the Romans were pretty inhumane. Like, and pretty stupid in that regard, right? Like, once again, who would think that torturing somebody is going to get them to tell the truth? Like, think about that. Like, that's such a stupid idea if you think that would work. But here, you read in the book of Acts, the Romans are going to do it because that's what they always do. They're going to torture somebody and try and get information out of them. And so, but before they can even do this, Paul, like, he plays the Roman citizenship card finally. And he's like, hey, you can't do this. This is wrong. But of course, it goes back to like, where some people would say, well, why didn't Paul use the Roman citizenship card earlier? And I think the defense I made also stands here as well, where Paul would only really use the Roman citizenship card, at least in this chapter, in a way that's like, it's to help other people. And it's not self-serving, which is ironic, right? Because the whole point of using your Roman citizenship card is to protect yourself, primarily from, non-Romans from assaulting you. It would protect It would protect you from other Romans from mistreating you, and to carry out judgment without fair trial and stuff like that. It would protect you, and so the way that Paul uses it is that the Roman citizenship card is not used to protect himself, but he uses it to protect others. And so back in chapter 21, when he doesn't use it when like the Jewish people are attacking him, like he is protecting a lot of Jewish people by not playing the Roman citizenship card. Because if the Jews had, actually really hurt him, and then it was known he was a Roman citizen, well, the Romans would have just gone to town and killed all those Jewish insurrectionists. Well, basically, that's what they would be. The Romans would just have free reign of killing them because they would have an excuse to do it. And if you give a Roman an excuse to kill somebody, you'd be damn sure they're going to use it. So Paul was using the Roman citizenship card then in chapter 21 to protect the Jews. Now here he's using it, I mean, he's also protecting the Romans in chapter 21. But here he's mainly protecting the Romans by using the Roman citizenship card, because he basically tells them, hey, you guys torture me, a Roman citizen, you guys can actually be in huge trouble. Some of you, you could lead to your own tortures. And that would just suck. And so Paul is actually protecting them. And I think that's a very interesting thing that, like, once again, it shows this kind of, like, a virtue that transcends just, like, things being legal, if that makes sense. Your people would traditionally call this like a virtue ethic thing that Paul does here, where he's displaying a form of ethics that's supposed to elevate this kind of how to be good and to live in create a set of behaviors on being good, as opposed to what is good means or what is good ends, deontology and consequentialism. But virtue ethics begs the question of, well, what must I do to be good? Not what is good or what has good ends, but, what must I do to be good? And so, and more importantly, what can I do that brings goodness? And so, that's kind of what Paul does here when he uses the Roman citizenship card in these weird instances, and where he doesn't use it either. I think that's kind of interesting that, like, Paul brings it up here, and he's like, you don't want to torture me because I'm a Roman citizen, and that could go really badly for you. And then, like, of course, the centurion, like, he's like, oh shit, like, I don't want to get in trouble. So he goes to the commander, and the commander's like, well, how did you become a Roman citizen? Because, I'm a Roman citizen as well, and but I bought mine. And then Paul says, well, I was born with mine. And there's something that's a little, may not be obvious to the modern reader, but citizenships had levels within, like, the Roman society. It's different, like, in Canada is different. In US it's probably the same as Canada, where citizenship is kind of like, there's only one level of citizen. Or basically you have two kinds of people in a country. You have citizen and non-citizen. So, your immigrant that doesn't become an official citizen. And then you have your immigrants who take the test and become citizens. You have people who are born citizens, etc. But see the difference. See, in Roman society back then, there were actually levels within your citizenship. So this commander who had to buy his citizenship, he's actually a lower tier Roman citizen. I know it's kind of weird to say it that way, but that's kind of how it is. Whereas, if, as Paul mentioned, he's born one, the implication is that he had always been a Roman citizen, and he is intrinsically Roman citizen. He is intrinsically Roman, which is interesting, because once again, Paul is ethnically Jewish. He has lived the life of a Jew, but then by being born a Roman citizen, there's this implication that he's actually, there's an intrinsic part of you that's Roman, which is weird to think about. Whereas a person who buys his citizenship, for instance, he's not intrinsically Roman. And that's why there's that, like, kind of difference between, like, oh, well, Paul being born a Roman actually puts him in a higher position, in a sense, than this commander. In, like, where they are as, like, viewed as Romans. It's kind of weird to think of it that way. Right? In Canada, we don't do that. If you're a Canadian citizen, however you got that citizenship doesn't really matter. So I'm born Canadian because I'm born I'm born and raised in Vancouver and still live there. I'm born and raised. So, but that makes no difference in say like a guy who came over from India, takes the citizenship test and becomes a Canadian citizen. There's actually, I can't say that like I'm a higher tier Canadian citizen. It doesn't work because Canadian citizenship doesn't work like that. The only place in the world that actually performs something like the Romans is actually Japan. Japan actually has something like this where you can entry, you can, and that's how they have a two-tier citizen. So you have Japan citizen, like you're born a Japanese citizen. Then you're a real Japanese citizen, or you can be what they call entry. You're an entry citizen. An entry citizen is lower tier than a born citizen, because, and it's even like the way that they refer to them is like you have Japanese citizen, and then the entry citizen is not even called a Japanese citizen, even though they're technically Japanese citizens. They're entry citizen. So you have foreigner, and then entry, and then Japanese. That's kind of how they have it in their tiers of citizenship. And so if you're a Japanese citizen, you have rights to particular like tax things and whatnot that like an entry would not have. And so some society, I think Japan's one of the few societies that does that still. They have a difference between like a born citizen and a entry citizen. Whereas like places like the US, they don't do that. There's just US citizen and not US citizen. Canada, either you're a Canadian citizen or you're not. There's no like tiers within the citizenship thing. Which is, so with that said, reading this passage of the Paul and the commander and them comparing like how they're citizens, it may seem like a foreign concept to us today, but especially in North America, because we don't practice this kind of thing in America. But in the ancient world, this was obviously a thing, where like yes, there were different types of citizenship within like being a Roman. I mean, you could read some of like Aurelius, and Aurelius talks a bit about this kind of thing. But the TLDR is that not all citizens are even treated as like having the same rights, and some of them having more rights than others. And so what's interesting is that Paul, by being born a Roman citizen, actually exists in this kind of highest levels of citizenship, or highest level of Roman culture, which is funny because he's not Italian. So I always found that kind of, it's just kind of weird, but like when you look at it now and you view like things like citizenry and stuff like that, it's kind of interesting with how citizens are to treat each other, and like consequences that could happen based on hierarchies within like being a citizen. But by being born one, Paul would have access to all the rights of a Roman citizen, whereas some would not have every right. Since they'd be entry citizens, not innately citizens. And there's that weird concept too of like being innately part of a people group as opposed to like joining the people group, if that makes sense. And I mean, see, Okay, so here's a terrible example. Probably gonna get me like thrown off YouTube, but the idea of like tiers within a type of citizenship doesn't exactly happen on like a legal level, but it happens a lot on ideological levels. So when people promote like a movement, like Black Lives Matter, you can be a Black Lives Matter like member, or you can actually be just part of the movement. Now, to be a member is very, very strict, and their criteria is very narrow. Gotta be a black person for starters, and you have to maintain all these like very neo-Marxist ideologies that all the heads of BML obviously operate under, and so you must have both those things. Now, you could just be a person who's part of the movement, because you have a lot of Caucasian people who are like, yeah, Black Lives Matter, and saying that they support the movement. But even though the white activists might believe all the things like the neo-Marxism and um, let's see, the other like extreme political thoughts that BML does promote, but they themselves are not black. So you can't really be part of Black Lives Matter if you're a white person promoting Black Lives Matter, because you're not black. And so things like that do exist, but they don't really exist on a legal level, because like once again, it's like most countries on a legality level have transcended this idea of tiers within like a citizenship, because once again, um, modern societies operate under a Christian paradigm. It's ironic here. The Christian paradigm is that no, all people are equal before God. And so when you make a set of citizenship, there's only one level within that. The biblical principle, as Paul would say it, is we are all citizens of heaven. And then that's where the next passage, the famous passage of there's no Greek, there's no Jew, there's no male, there's no female, etc., in this citizenship of heaven. Because we're all equal in what constitutes us as being citizens of heaven. And so modern cultures, like say the US and in Canada, they've adopted that idea. And so if you become going back to a nationalist level now, if you become a US citizen, well, it doesn't matter any other factor about yourself. If you're registered as a US citizen, then you are entitled to all US citizen rights. However you got there is not relevant. The fact is you are a US citizen. Just like how in Christianity, it doesn't matter how you came to faith in Christianity. Whether it was through like, watching TV pastors, or, you were just reading the Bible one day because some YouTuber told you it was a good idea to do it. Or, you had been raised in a church. Doesn't matter how you got there, a Christian, assuming you believe all the right things, the resurrection of Jesus Christ primarily and all that stuff, the things that matter anyway, then you're a Christian, right? And so that monolithic style of citizenship was a much more radical idea as opposed to like ancient ways, the older societies. Obviously, hierarchies. They used a lot more hierarchies because, well, to be fair, hierarchies make sense in that regard. Like, it makes sense rationally to have like a hierarchy even among citizenships, because let's take it in this perspective. Now, I personally don't believe this, but I'll use this as an example. So, being born a Canadian citizen, technically, I should have more access and rights within living in Canada than, let's say, an Indian immigrant. even though he became a Canadian citizen, he took the exam, he passed, and he became a Canadian citizen. On his papers, it'll say he's Canadian. But the logic is, well, I have always been part of the Canadian culture. The Indian immigrant, was not. And so by transient of something innate in me, but of course, you gotta see where the problem with this is, where this is going. Something innate in me makes me more Canadian. And so another person, just because they pass some exam, I should have more rights than them. Now, once if you really think it through, well, it's really terrible way of thinking, which is why, once again, most cultures adopt a more Christian idea of a monolithic citizenship. But you get the idea that, like, in the ancient world, it wasn't like that. Hierarchies existed because people wanted to maintain, like, that kind of older rationale of, like, well, no, if I'm part of this people group, then I deserve all its rights. But once again, it's, empires rise and fall anyway. So in the grand scheme of things, you don't need to get so caught up on the hierarchies of things like that. And that was something that modern cultures understood very well, as they allowed themselves to adopt a more Christian idea of a monolithic citizenship. Alright, so just to finish up the reading here. So Paul scares this commander guy by, like, I'm born a citizen. The guy's like, oh, we can't assault this guy or anything. We can't torture him or anything. So what are we going to do? Well, why don't we allow him to face his accusers? And let's actually do this right. We got to do everything with due process. And so the end of chapter 22, which builds up to chapter 23, is that they begin this, who is it again? It was the commander of this barracks. He sets up a meeting between Paul and the religious leaders. Of course, this would have been easy because, once again, I showed you, like, way back. Too lazy to get the diagram now, but basically, if you looked at the second temple, the second temple would have the barracks kind of right next to it. If you look at, like, those ancient remodelings of, like, old school Jerusalem, which makes sense that the barracks would be next to the temple, because the temple would be the center of Jewish culture. And so the occupying force, the Romans, if they were to have close grips on the Jewish people, well, you gotta have a hard grip on the center of their culture. And in the Jews' case, it would be the temple. So of course the barracks would be next to the temple, because they wanted to have their clutches on the center of culture. It just makes sense. And so for the commander to assemble the Sanhedrin would not actually be very difficult. Of course, that was another reason why the Jews had a lot of animosity toward the Romans, because, like, well, this is a weenie dog. You guys just kind of have your clutches around, like, the centerpiece of our culture. Like, who do you think you are? And so, that would no doubt raise some animosity between the Jews and the Romans. But anyway, that's basically it for chapters 21 and 22. Paul enters Jerusalem. The TLDR is Paul enters Jerusalem, and then there's a hoot. And so the next few chapters is just, like, how they try to deal with Paul, because, like, he ends up kind of being a huge pain in the ass for them while he's in Jerusalem and hanging around in Judea. But anyway, we'll read that. And I know it's kind of funny that, like, chapter 22 kind of ends off on a cliffhanger, because chapter 23 basically begins with, like, a speech, and Paul goes on quite a few of these in these last few chapters. But with that said, we're gonna wait till next week to read chapter 23. It is like 5:15. My throat is a little dry, so I'll just kind of do some housekeeping. If you have questions, go ahead and shoot them. So basically, next week, next week will be the same as this week, basically. Just kind of just only reading stream next Wednesday. And that will be at 3 o'clock Pacific time. I know it was a little late today, but I'll try and be on time next week at 3 o'clock. And that would be basically it. We're just going to do more reading streams until we get to August. I kind of like having, I like it being a little slower like this on the channel because, of course, one, work has picked up a little bit, so there's that. And second, like with some, I'm not gonna lie, it's summertime, so I kind of like being out a bit more and enjoying the summer heat because, where I live, it's not nice out that often. It's pretty crappy weather most of the year. So when it's nice and when it's a nice summer like what we're having right now in Vancouver, you be damn sure I'm taking advantage of that. So that's kind of why I haven't been around as much. But once August comes around, I will be doing the Xenoblade Chronicles stream Let's Play with my buddy Shining Light. So that's going to be a grand old time. That will be starting on, August basically August 1st. I think is the first Monday, if I'm right. Yeah, August 1st. So, August will start off with a banger. And we'll be doing Xenoblade Chronicles. But until then, I like to have July be a little bit, lighter on the streams. We just do Bible reading streams on Wednesdays. And that'll be it. So that's all you can, that's all you're going to expect for next week as well is basically a Bible reading stream as well. And that'll be next week at 3 o'clock Pacific time. Anyway, this is going to be the end of the stream. I thank you guys for coming, reading Acts chapters 21 and 22 with me. And I just hope that you guys will take care of yourselves, continue reading the scriptures. If you have questions, you can always contact me about them. And yeah, I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Keep enjoying your summer. And God bless you.